Hi, this is Ms. Hadi from Olympian High School. We've been using the Traditions and Encounters textbook to learn about challenges to superpower hegemony. Now I'm going to quickly go over the slides. I've already taught you the information. So this is just a quick recap of everything that you've learned. First, you need to know that not everybody was on board with the Soviet Union in terms of satellite states blindly being obedient to the Soviet Union. One example is Yugoslavia, which I taught you. Yugoslavia had been independently communist from the beginning, and their leader, Tito Marshall, was not on friendly terms with Stalin and with the leader of the Soviet Union. So he was expelled from the Soviet bloc in 1948. Then it's really important to write down historical context for the next two situations that we're going to be discussing, and that is that it's after the death of Stalin that Khrushchev comes to power in the Soviet Union, and there's this process of de-Stalinization where they start to allow for more open criticism of Stalin and his harsh policies and start to remove photos of Stalin from public spaces and to start to sort of take away some of the romanticism of his leadership and to allow for more open criticism of Stalin. So it's within that context of de-Stalinization that two countries, Hungary and Czechoslovakia, start to try to introduce more liberal reforms to soften their type of socialism. Hungary in 1956 led a reform movement that ended with the Soviet Union bringing in their military and killing the leader of the nationalist movement there, Imre Nagy. And in Czechoslovakia, a country that no longer exists, the term for their attempt at liberalization was the Prague Spring. And in a similar way, the Soviet Union invaded with tanks and crushed that movement there. This type of intervention was justified by the successor to Brezhnev, the person that comes after him, to Khrushchev, whose name was Brezhnev, and that justification was called the Brezhnev Doctrine, and it basically said that the Soviet Union had the right to invade any country that was threatened by elements hostile to socialism. So, in a way, it's reminiscent of the Roosevelt corollary that the United States used to have, that justified intervention in Latin America. Okay, in terms of the Chinese relationship with the Soviet Union, that's going to change as well. So at first, China is going to be allied with the Soviet Union, but that relationship will weaken. Let's go back to what happened in China. So prior to the outbreak of World War II, there was a civil war between communists and nationalists that wanted democracy, and that was temporarily paused to fight against the Japanese during World War II. Well, at the end of World War II, the Japanese go home and the fighting between communists and nationalists resumes. Eventually, the Chinese communists are winning, and Jiang Jiechi, also named Chiang Kai-shek, is forced to retreat to the island of Taiwan. With his nationalist forces, he takes with him most of China's gold reserves. Meanwhile, Mao Zedong proclaims a separate communist country, the People's Republic of China, and starts to dramatically transform Chinese society into a communist mold. Most of the power in communist China was concentrated in the hands of Mao Zedong and the Communist Party. People that were associated with the old Nationalist Party or Jiang Jiechi, ex-nationalists, were executed or sent to reform camps. And then there was an attempt to quickly reform Chinese society for rapid industrialization using Soviet-style 5-year plans. So that included quick rapid industrialization and collectivization. You need to know what those two words mean. So when I say collectivization, they're taking individual farms from private farmers and they're making them one large farm and trying to hit certain quotas for how much should be produced on that farm. This is going to have a very negative effect. We'll talk about it soon. But some positive effects are going to be universal health care, education, and changes to gender and family roles, so allowing women to get a divorce, ending things like foot binding, so giving women more power within the society. By the way, there's an amazing film that you can watch for extra credit called To Live, and that really shows the transformation of China from before the communist takeover until after. Excellent movie. So remember the word metonym. It's when we use a part of something to represent the whole. So here, when I'm talking about Beijing-Moscow relations, what I'm really talking about is China and the Soviet Union relationship and how that changes. Initially, they were both concerned about the United States rehabilitation of Japan, and they worked together. China recognized the primacy of the USSR as the first country to become communist. They received military aid, technical advisors from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was also their principal trading partner, I believe, purchasing about half of China's goods. But then there starts to be cracks in this alignment, this this relationship. So friction over a few things. The USSR claimed neutrality in a conflict between India and China over the land of Tibet. There's also problems as the United States starts to pursue peaceful coexistence. As the Soviet Union starts to pursue peaceful coexistence with the United States. I don't think I said that correctly either time. The Soviet Union and the United States try to have peaceful coexistence under Khrushchev, and that causes the Chinese to start calling the Soviet Union names, basically calling them revisionists, which is a mean, derisive term in the communist vocabulary. Okay, and then between the United States and the USSR, there's a temporary reduction in hostility called a détente. We see that in a series of agreements where they start to work together, and the most important of those agreements is the SALT talks, the Strategic Arms Limitation talks. But that détente is going to disappear in the 1980s when there are lots of issues between the United States and the USSR, and also because of the improving relationship between the United States and China. Meanwhile, the Chinese and the Soviet Union start to not get along. There's also two situations that are really tension escalating: the situation in Afghanistan and the situation in Vietnam. So you want to think of the USSR as meddling in Afghanistan and the United States as meddling in Vietnam. We'll look at the US defeat in Vietnam. So again, the way that the book presents to you the Vietnam conflict is confusing. They start with the beginning of the conflict in chapter 39, which is obviously after the one we're in now, chapter 38. So it might be helpful to go skip to chapter 39, read about the Vietnamese beginning of that conflict, and then go back to 38. But the essence of it is that the French come back to Vietnam to try to recolonize it after World War II, and the Vietnamese expel them. So now there's the issue of what's going to happen with this new country, Vietnam. Is it going to be communist? Is it going to be capitalist democratic? Obviously, the United States, because of the Cold War, is going to want to help anyone who's non-communist. So they're going to assist the non-communist Vietnamese in the South after the French leave, and the US start to increase their aid. They start to send military troops there, and the conflict escalates and then eventually ends in a stalemate. President Nixon gets elected saying that he's going to end the war, but actually he escalates bombings and extends them secretly into Cambodia. Finally, the U.S. negotiate an exit. They leave in 1973. The war between communists and non-communists continues, and eventually the South is defeated in 1975, and the entire country is reunified as a communist country. So all of the lives lost, many people argue, well, some people might say, well, what was the point? Became communist anyway, and we killed so many people. This is a very, very debatable issue, whether or not the U.S. should have gotten involved in Vietnam in the first place. Then there is the situation of the Soviets meddling in Afghanistan. So Afghanistan was an Islamic nation. So they practiced Islam. They were non-aligned until 1978 when a pro-Soviet coup brought a communist government to power. The problem is this communist government was very radical in terms of in things that they introduced that seemed to threaten Islamic culture. So that led to a backlash, a resistance movement against the communists. The Soviet Union, because of the Cold War, is going to intervene to help the communists. This leads them to fighting these Afghan mujahideen. Mujahideen are Islamic warriors. Guess who backs these guys up? Well, it's the Cold War. So the Soviet Union is backing up the communists inside Afghanistan, and the United States is backing up the mujahideen. The United States CIA supplies the mujahideen with ground-to-air Stinger missiles and other supports. Eventually, the USSR is forced to pull out. When they pull out, a group called the Taliban comes to power after a civil war. We'll come back to this situation of the Taliban later. Oops. Go forward. So you also have countercultural protests, so movies and artwork that are a critique of what was going on in terms of the superpowers and this crazy coming to the brink of nuclear war that seemed to be emerging. So you have movies like Dr. Strangelove or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, which portrayed the leaders of the two countries as being crazy. Massive anti-Vietnam protests, rock and roll. You've got Elvis, you've got the Beatles. And then you have the Watergate scandal, which highlighted sort of not having leaders that you can trust. President Nixon ordered these illegal wiretaps, and eventually this was discovered. He was forced to resign in 1974. Okay, I hope that was a good review of everything that I taught you over the course of the 3 lecture videos.